Professor Vextarian adjusted his crystalline spectacles for the third time in as many minutes, a nervous habit that had developed over his 2 centuries of teaching advanced xenobiology. The morning light streaming through the bioluminescent windows of Galactic University's most prestigious lecture hall cast an eerie blue glow across his scaled features. This was it, the class he'd been dreading since the semester began. "Welcome, students, to Advanced Xenobiology 411, he announced, his voice carrying the kind of authority that only came from having 6 different doctoral degrees and a reputation for making grown Klingons weep. As you all know, this course deals exclusively with the most dangerous biological compounds known to civilized space. The assembled students represented the cream of the galactic crop. There was Keelik, an insectoid from the hive worlds, whose compound eyes twitched nervously as she took notes with all 4 of her writing appendages simultaneously. Her species was known for their analytical prowess, which made her constant state of anxiety somewhat endearing, like watching a genius have a panic attack in slow motion. Next to her sat Zorblad, a gelatinous being from the nebula colonies who had somehow managed to look smug despite lacking anything resembling a face. His translucent body pulsed with different colors as he absorbed information directly through his semi-permeable membrane, a process that always made Professor Vextarian slightly nauseous to watch. "Today," the professor continued, gesturing toward a heavily reinforced containment unit at the center of the room, "we will be analyzing a sample that has stumped the galaxy's finest minds for over 3 standard decades." The unit hummed ominously, surrounded by enough warning labels to paper a small moon. "This unknown toxin was discovered on a remote death world and has claimed the lives of 47 researchers across 12 different species." Quillick's antennae drooped with worry. "Professor, are you certain the containment protocols are sufficient? My carapace is still molting from last week's acid demonstration." Zorblet rippled with what passed for laughter among his kind. "Perhaps if you weren't such a fragile little bug, you wouldn't need to worry about every minor chemical exposure." "Minor?" Keelik's mandibles clicked indignantly. "That acid dissolved a hole through 3 floors of the chemistry building." Professor Vextarian sighed deeply. Teaching the galaxy's most dangerous biological compounds was challenging enough without having to referee interspecies drama. He was about to restore order when the lecture hall doors burst open with enough force to rattle the quantum stabilizers, and stumbled what could only be described as a walking disaster. Marcus Rodriguez, though he insisted everyone call him Tank, looked like he'd been hit by a freight hauler, dragged through a wormhole, and then asked to solve quantum equations. His dark hair stuck up at angles that defied at least 3 laws of physics. His clothes appeared to have been slept in, and he carried with him an aroma that made several students immediately activate their personal atmosphere filter. "Sorry I'm late, Prof," Tank mumbled, squinting against the classroom lighting as if it were personally offensive to his entire existence. "Had a bit of a night, if you know what I mean." The collective intake of breath from the assembled students could have powered a small space station. Keelik's compound eyes went wide with terror, her exoskeleton actually clicking as she tried to make herself smaller. Zorblet's gelatinous form turned a sickly yellow color and began vibrating at a frequency that suggested either fear or the onset of mitosis. "Ah, yes," Professor Vextarian said, his voice dripping with the kind of resigned dread usually reserved for tax audits or surprise visits from the Galactic Health Department. "Class, meet our exchange student from Earth, Marcus Rodriguez, representing the first and hopefully last human to darken the doorways of advanced xenobiology." Tank cracked open what appeared to be some sort of metallic cylinder and took a long swig, completely oblivious to the fact that half the class had begun backing toward the emergency exits. "Hey everybody, great to be here. Love what you've done with the place. Very academic, very sterile. Really sets the mood for learning, you know." "Earth," whispered a student from the back. "Isn't that classified as a Class 12 death world?" "The very same," Professor Vextarian confirmed grimly. "A planet so hostile that its dominant species evolved to find danger refreshing and pain educational." Tank looked genuinely puzzled by this description while taking another casual sip from his mystery beverage. "I mean, sure, Earth's got its challenges, but doesn't everywhere? Besides, I brought coffee, so today's looking up already." Professor Vextarian decided that ignoring the human might be the safest course of action for everyone's mental health. He gestured dramatically toward the containment unit, which looked like it could house a small nuclear reactor. "Now then, class, observe our specimen. This toxin sample represents one of the greatest mysteries in modern xenobiology." The containment unit was a marvel of engineering, surrounded by force fields, quantum locks, and enough warning signs to stock a paranoia convention. Red lights blinked ominously around its perimeter, and a steady hum indicated that roughly half the university's power grid was dedicated to keeping whatever was inside from getting out. "The compound you see before you," the professor continued, his voice taking on the reverent tone usually reserved for discussing extinct civilizations or really good tenure packages, "has defeated our best scientific minds. Advanced AI systems have crashed attempting to analyze its molecular structure. Telepathic species have refused to even approach it after the first volunteer went catatonic for 6 months. Quillick raised one of her forearms tentatively. "Professor, what exactly does this toxin do to living tissue?" "An excellent question, Miss Quillick. The compound appears to cause immediate cellular breakdown at the quantum level. Victims report experiencing what can only be described as having their entire nervous system replaced with fire ants while their internal organs attempt to escape through their pores." Even Zorblat stopped his smug pulsin at that description. "How many researchers has it killed?" 47 confirmed fatalities across 12 species, Professor Vextarian replied gravely. "The Galactic Council has classified it as a Class A extinction threat. 1 drop could theoretically contaminate an entire water supply." The students began pulling out equipment that looked like it belonged in a science fiction movie's idea of what the future should look like. Quantum analyzers hummed to life. Psychic amplifiers began glowing with ethereal energy, and molecular scanners projected holographic displays that would have made any Earth scientist weep with envy. Meanwhile, Tank had wandered closer to the containment unit, squinting at it with the kind of focused attention usually reserved for trying to remember where you left your keys. He tilted his head to one side, then the other, like a confused dog hearing a whistle. "Ah," he muttered, just loud enough for the nearest students to hear and immediately scoot further away. "That's weird." Quillick's antennae twitched nervously. "What's weird, human Tank?" "I don't know," Tank said, scratching his head and somehow making his hair stick up at even more impossible angles. "It's just that smell coming from the containment thing. It's really familiar, you know, like really familiar." Professor Vextarian paused mid-lecture. "Smell? Mr. Rodriguez, that containment unit is sealed with quantum locks. Nothing should be able to escape, least of all aromatic molecules." Tank shrugged, taking another swig from his mysterious beverage. "Yeah, well, I've got a pretty good nose. Comes from growing up around my grandmother's cooking. Trust me, after surviving her experimental fusion cuisine, you develop a keen sense for dangerous chemicals." The professor felt a small tremor of unease, the kind that usually preceded either groundbreaking discoveries or catastrophic explosions. In his experience, there wasn't much difference between the two. Tank continued staring at the containment unit with the kind of intense concentration that suggested either deep scientific thought or a really stubborn hangover. The other students had been working frantically with their advanced equipment for nearly an hour, producing readings that made absolutely no sense and occasionally causing small explosions that required immediate evacuation protocols. "Professor," Tank said suddenly, raising his hand like he was back in elementary school, "can I take a closer look at that sample?" The silence that followed was so complete that you could have heard a photon drop. Professor Vextharden's scales actually changed color, cycling through what Tank would later learn was the draconian equivalent of a nervous breakdown. "Mr. Rodriguez," the professor said carefully, "that containment unit is sealed with quantum locks that require a team of 12 specialists and approval from 3 different galactic committees to open." "Right, yeah, totally get that," Tank nodded agreeably, then reached out and simply twisted what looked like the world's most complicated safe dial. There was a series of clicks, several ominous beeps, and then the massive containment unit opened with a soft hiss. Quillick fainted immediately, her exoskeleton clattering against the floor. Zorblat turned completely transparent and began making a sound like a deflating balloon. Half the class dove under their desks, while the other half activated emergency teleportation beacons. "Rodoxofer!" Professor Vextharian shrieked, his voice hitting frequencies that shattered 2 beakers and caused the quantum analyzers to start smoking. "That's a galactic extension event you just unleashed!" Tank, meanwhile, had leaned over the now open container and taken a deep whiff. His expression went from puzzled to recognition to something that could only be described as mild disappointment. "Oh, come on," he said, actually rolling his eyes. "Are you serious right now?" Before anyone could stop him, before the emergency containment systems could activate, before Professor Vextharian could finish his prayer to whatever deity protected foolish academics from their student stupidity, Tank reached into the container, pulled out what appeared to be a small vial of dark liquid, and drank the entire thing in one gulp. The silence that followed wasn't just complete, it was geological. It was the kind of silence that suggested the universe itself had paused to process what it had just witnessed. Tank smacked his lips thoughtfully, like a wine critic at a particularly disappointing tasting. Yep, just like I thought. This is coffee. Really, really bad coffee, but definitely coffee. Specifically, this tastes like it came from that truck stop on I-95 outside of Jacksonville. You know, the one where the coffee's been sitting on the burners since the Clinton administration. Professor Vextarian made a sound like air escaping from a punctured lung. Coffee? Yeah, coffee. You know, brown liquid, caffeine, makes you not want to murder people before 10 a.m.? Tank looked around at the horrified faces surrounding him. Though this is pretty weak stuff, my grandmother makes coffee that could wake the dead and possibly grant them superpowers. But, the professor stammered, the cellular breakdown, the quantum disruption, the 47 fatalities. Tank scratched his head again. Ooh yeah, that makes sense now. See, caffeine is basically a pesticide that coffee plants evolved to kill insects. It's pretty much poison to most living things. Humans just developed a tolerance because, well, we're stubborn like that. Plus, we really, really need to wake up in the morning. He pulled out his thermos and unscrewed the cap. Immediately, every scanner in the room started screaming warnings about biological weapons and imminent doom. Want some? This is the good stuff. I brought it from home. Zorblat had managed to reconstitute enough to speak, though he was still mostly transparent. You mean to tell us that your species voluntarily consumes what we consider to be a weapon of mass destruction? Multiple times a day, Tank confirmed cheerfully. Some people drink like 8 cups, though personally I think that's excessive. I usually stick to just the 1 pot in the morning. Professor Vextarian sat down heavily in his chair, staring at the human who had just solved the galaxy's greatest biological mystery by drinking it and complaining about the quality. Tank, completely oblivious to the fact that he had just caused what amounted to a galactic scientific revolution, took another sip from his thermos and continued his impromptu lecture on human beverage consumption. See, the thing about coffee, he said, gesturing with his thermos in a way that made 3 students duck for cover, is that it's all about the roast and the grind. This stuff you guys were so worried about? That's what we call over-extracted. Probably been sitting in a pot for hours, maybe days. The bitter compounds have had time to really develop, which explains why it would taste absolutely terrible to species that aren't used to consuming plant-based neurotoxins. Professor Vextarian's crystalline spectacles had fogged over completely. Plant-based neurotoxins, he repeated weakly. Oh yeah, caffeine is basically nature's way of saying please don't eat me to bugs and small animals. It screws with their nervous systems something fierce. But humans? Tank shrugged. We looked at this natural pesticide and said, hey, this makes us feel more awake. Let's drink it every morning for the rest of our lives. Classic human logic, really. Kulik had been helped back into her seat, though her compound eyes were still spinning in different directions. But the fatalities, the researchers who died. Right, well, that's because your species probably process caffeine completely differently than we do, Tank explained, pulling up a chair and sitting backwards on it like he was about to give the world's most casual TED Talk. Humans have this enzyme called cytochrome P450 that breaks down caffeine. Without it, even a small amount would probably cause cardiac arrest, seizures, and a whole bunch of other, really unpleasant ways to die. He took another sip from his thermos, and the room's atmosphere monitors immediately started flashing red. Plus, we've been drinking this stuff for thousands of years, so we've built up quite a tolerance. What's a normal morning wake-up call for us is apparently a galactic extinction event for everyone else. Zorblat had managed to regain most of his opacity, though he was still trembling like cosmic jello. Are you telling us that humans regularly consume substances that would be classified as chemical weapons by the Galactic Council? Well, when you put it like that, it sounds way more dramatic than it actually is, Tank replied. Though now that I think about it, yeah, probably. I mean, we also eat things like chocolate, which is poisonous to most Earth animals. And, don't get me started on alcohol, which is literally a poison that we drink for fun. Professor Vextarian made a strangled noise. Alcohol? Oh man, wait until you meet my buddy Steve. He can drink a whole bottle of whiskey and still be functional enough to fix a car engine. Though to be fair, the car usually runs worse afterward, but that might not be related to the alcohol. The professor stood up slowly, his legs shaking like a newborn space deer. Mr. Rodriguez, are you implying that your thermos contains a concentration of this caffeine toxin that exceeds the sample we've been studying? Tank glanced at his thermos thoughtfully. This? Nah, this is pretty mild stuff. Maybe twice as strong as what you had in that fancy container. If you really want to see something impressive, you should try espresso. That's concentrated coffee that's strong enough to wake the dead and probably grant them temporary superpowers. Twice as strong, the professor whispered. Give or take, though if you really want to see something that would probably register as a weapon of mass destruction on your scanners, I've got some energy drinks back in my dorm room. Those things have enough caffeine to probably power a small spacecraft. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Killick quietly hyperventilating into a breathing apparatus designed for anxiety attacks. Energy drinks, Professor Vextherian repeated, his voice hollow. Yeah, they're great for staying up all night studying, though they do make your heart beat so fast you can sometimes hear colors. But that's probably normal, right? Tank's casual attitude about consuming what the rest of the galaxy considered to be industrial-grade poison was starting to give everyone in the room a headache. Or possibly, that was just the fumes from his thermos, which the air filtration system was treating like a biological hazard. Mr. Rodriguez, the professor said carefully, would it be possible for you to provide us with a detailed list of substances that humans regularly consume? For, research purposes? Sure thing, Prof, though you might want to sit down first. We also eat things like capsaicin, which is the chemical that makes peppers hot. It's literally an irritant designed to cause pain, and we put it on food because it makes everything taste better. Professor Vextherion sat back down very quickly indeed. 3 standard galactic weeks later, the ripple effects of what the university administration had officially designated as the coffee incident were still being felt across civilized space. Tank Rodriguez had gone from being an unknown exchange student to the most famous human in the galaxy, though he remained blissfully unaware of his celebrity status. I still don't understand why everyone's making such a big deal about this, Tank said, sitting in Professor Vexthorian's office while sipping from what was now his 3rd thermos of the day. The office had been equipped with a military-grade air filtration system after the first meeting, and the professor now wore what looked like a hazmat suit whenever Tank visited. Mr. Rodriguez, Professor Vextherian said, his voice slightly muffled by his protective gear. You solved a 30-year-old mystery that had claimed 47 lives by drinking the evidence and asking for seconds. The Galactic Science Council has nominated you for the Nobel Prize in Applied Stupidity. Is that a real award? We made it specifically for you. Meanwhile, outside the office, a line of alien students stretched around the building, all waiting for a chance to purchase what Tank had started calling diluted Death World toxins from his new campus coffee cart. The irony that the galaxy's most feared biological weapon was now being sold for 2 credits a cup by a hungover college student was not lost on anyone, especially the Galactic Health Department, who had given up trying to regulate Tank's operation after their inspection team required therapy. Killick had become Tank's first regular customer, though she could only handle coffee diluted to roughly 1,000th the strength of what Tank drank. Even at that concentration, it made her vibrate at frequencies that allowed her to phase through solid matter, which she found useful for getting to class on time. The really weird part, Tank continued, completely ignoring the professor's obvious distress, is that everyone keeps asking me about other human foods. Like yesterday, this delegation from the Rigel system offered me a research grant just to analyze my lunch. Professor Vextherian's eye twitched behind his protective visor. After the coffee revelation, he'd made the mistake of looking up other common human consumables. The discovery that humans regularly ate something called ghost peppers had kept him awake for 3 days straight. The realization that chocolate was a mild neurotoxin that humans gave to their children as treats had required medication. Speaking of lunch, Tank said, reaching into his backpack and pulling out what appeared to be a normal sandwich. I brought some hot sauce if you want to try it. Every alarm in the office immediately began shrieking. The bottle Tank had pulled out was roughly the size of a standard laboratory beaker and glowed with an ominous red light that suggested it was either radioactive or from hell, possibly both. That's Carolina Reaper sauce, Tank explained cheerfully, completely ignoring the fact that the office's emergency containment systems had activated. It's made from peppers that register about 2.2 million on the Scoville scale. Great on eggs, totally transforms a boring sandwich, and it's got this really nice smoky flavor that goes well with pretty much everything. Professor Vextherian had gone completely still, the kind of stillness that suggested his higher brain functions had temporarily shut down to prevent a complete psychotic break. 2.2 million on the Scoville scale. Yeah, though if you really want to experience something special, I've got some bomb sauce back in my room that hits about 100,000 Scovilles higher. That stuff is so hot it's basically a war crime in liquid form. I put it on pizza. You put chemical weapons on pizza, the professor whispered. Well, When you say it like that, it sounds way more dangerous than it actually is, Tank replied, then paused thoughtfully. Though I guess from your perspective most of what humans eat probably qualifies as chemical weapons. Huh. That explains a lot about why everyone keeps staring at me during meals. The professor's communicator began buzzing frantically. He glanced at it and saw 17 missed calls from the Galactic News Network, 43 interview requests from various scientific journals, and one message from the Galactic Council asking if Earth needed to be reclassified, from Death World to Nightmare Realm. Mr. Rodriguez, Professor Vaxthorian said slowly, I'm beginning to understand why the rest of the galaxy is terrified of your species. Tank looked genuinely confused by this statement. Terrified? Why would anyone be terrified of humans? We're like the friendliest species in the galaxy. We'll share our food with anyone, we're always up for a good time, and we're really helpful in a crisis. You share your food, the professor repeated. Of course. Just last week I gave some of my energy drinks to those exchange students from Proxima Centauri. They seemed really excited about it, though they did have to go to the medical center afterward, probably not used to staying up for 72 hours straight. Their loss, really. You should have seen how much studying they got done before they collapsed. Professor Vaxthorian closed his eyes and began what sounded like a prayer in ancient Draconian. Through his office window, he could see Tank's coffee cart surrounded by alien students, all of them wearing protective gear while carefully sipping beverages that their home worlds would classify as weapons of mass destruction. In the distance, the university's emergency response team was setting up a perimeter around the human dormitory after Tank had mentioned something about having really good barbecue sauce in his room. The Galactic Hazmat Division was reportedly en route. You know what? Tank said, finishing his coffee and standing up to leave. Tomorrow I'm thinking of bringing in some of my grandmother's homemade salsa. She grows her own peppers and they're so hot they're technically classified as a controlled substance in 3 states back on Earth. Should be fun. As Tank walked out of the office, whistling what sounded suspiciously like a funeral dirge, Professor Vaxthorian reached for his emergency communication device. It was time to call in sick for the rest of the semester. Possibly the rest of his career. Outside, the sound of alien students discovering the joys of caffeine addiction mixed with the wailing of emergency sirens and the distant rumble of Galactic Health Department containment vehicles. Just another typical day at Galactic University, now that humanity had joined the academic community. And somewhere in the student cafeteria, Tank Rodriguez was asking if they had any decent hot sauce to go with his dinner, completely unaware that he had just redefined the galaxy's understanding of what constituted a weapon of mass destruction.